you because you stop for a second on that page. So it takes a couple of minutes. You know, the effects on the battery are pretty well negated because it doesn't last too terribly long.
What's the battery life on those?
About 5 to 7 with the GPS on.
And the 310 is, would you say 20 or is it not quite that?
20 with the 310.
Do they all charge in the same method? Same way?
Pretty close. With this guy, and the 405 and the 310 use the same kind of, I call it a chip clip because that's what it looks like. The 110 clip is a little different in that it has the 4 connections, but the same general idea. Now the 110 is not a wireless compatibility to the computer, it is a wired. So when you want to transfer data, you plug it in. Some people will actually like that more. You know, if you're dealing with a PC, you run into issues with, you know, wireless stuff. If somebody's not especially savvy with a computer, that can be a giant headache for them. And, you know, multiple phone calls in, trying to figure out what they're doing. With this, you plug it in. Once it's working, you're not going to run into problems.
The Ant Plus and Garmin Connect, is it all up and running on Mac now?
Yes. And what the Ant Plus is basically the Ant Plus goes on the computer. It talks through that Ant wireless stick that we had talked about that then talks to the watch. So all your data from the watch goes through there. Also any of your firmware updates for like a 405 or the 60 or the 310 then come out of there as well. And then with the 110, everything's hardwired. So whether you're doing firmware updates, you're downloading data, or you're charging, it's all through this cable. Firmware
update would be the software on the watch?
Correct.
So is that something that a person has to do?
It's highly, highly recommended. When they go to register the product, it will require them to run a firmware update. The reason being is we want to give them the best product possible, and if we've found bugs and we've corrected them through those firmware updates, the last thing we want them to do is take that brand new product out and it still has that bug in there. Also, when they open Garmin Connect, it'll tell them if there's a firmware update, you know, for their device, or they can just sign up for email updates and we'll let them know when a firmware update's available for their device. That's always free of charge for the firmware updates. The nice thing with that too is if we can add features to a device, we'll add features to a device. Any bugs that are corrected are done through that. I always tell people, if the watch is doing something just weird and silly, and it's kind of like, it's hard to explain almost, or it just does it intermittently, firmware update like 80% of the time will correct that. I almost look at it as like an oil change for the device. If your car is running kind of weird, you go change the oil, hey, poof, it's magically fixed. Same kind of thing with the watch. Occasionally a firmware update will do it just fine. Even if the person says, oh, the update came out and I did it, or there's not a current one, it'll give you the option to reinstall the same version. Give that a try as well. That will also kind of clear out maybe any errant data that may be causing problems with the watches.
I would imagine probably if a couple of us get good at that, if someone has a problem with their watch they can bring in, we could just update the firmwork for them.
Yeah, if you have the Ant stick for one of the wireless devices.
We need theirs, or do we need any of them?
If it could really be any of them. Okay. You know, you'll have to pair and find their device and that sort of thing. So each time it'll take a little bit longer than it normally would for the customer, but it's certainly easy to do.
That erase all other stored data on the machine?
The firmware update, it can. It doesn't always, but it kind of depends on the watch and what's going on with it. So we usually try, and if it's at all possible, get the data off there. In a perfect world, people would be getting the data off there on a pretty regular basis anyways. You know, when I talk to people, hey, are you using a log right now? When you get done, you write down in your log. Same kind of thing would apply. If you really want to keep on top of it, take the watch off, go right inside, load your data over, and you're done. And with the wireless devices, that can be as simple as taking the watch off and setting it by the computer and letting it do itself. Or here, it's plugging it in and telling it to transfer.
How long does it usually take to transfer the data once you set it down?
A minute at the most. And that's with a lot of data on there. Usually it's less than that.
And it only updates the newest data, probably?
Yeah. And you can adjust the Ant agent to wipe the device clean, after it's done, leave all the data on the watch, however you want to handle that. But yeah, it won't duplicate into Garmin Connect anything you've got.
Does having more stored data make it take longer to find satellites and things like that?
Typically, no. Typically, when you have problems with satellite acquisition, it's one of a couple of things. Either the watch hasn't been worn for a very long time, in which case all the devices will store 2 bits of data from the satellites. And basically both of those are an attempt to acquire faster the next time it turns on. And so if it's been a really long time, that data is no longer valid. Because essentially what that data is it's a roadmap of the sky of where each satellite should be at any given point. Well, over time that data becomes inaccurate. So then the watch is like, 24 is supposed to be there, and it will just continue to stare at that spot until it finds 24. Or until it finally gives up and goes through a rescan, where it scans the sky for anything. Getting to that rescan can take 15, 20 minutes. So if the data is bad, it's going to take longer. If they move more than 300 miles from where they last had it on, again, since you're on a different axis on the globe, then all the satellites are shifted over into a different orbit. So again, it can take a little bit longer there. If something is just being very, very stubborn, going through and doing a firmware update actually clears out those almanac logs and forces the device to scan right from the get-go. That can actually speed up the process.
So for people who travel then, like when they get to wherever they're going, they should turn it on, find the satellites, not right before they run, but probably, when they get to somewhere where they...
if they think, if they hop off the plane and they're, going to run that night, it's not a bad idea. Pull it out of the bag, throw it up on the dash, and let it find satellites, and then you can turn it off and put it away. I always tell people to remember to, carry your charging cable with you, because if it takes a while to find those satellites, your battery life is going to be impacted by that, and you want to have the ability to charge it back up before you actually go out. Especially if you're charging, if you're traveling for a race, you don't want to get to the race and spend a quarter of your battery just trying to find satellites. You're not going to make it through the race.
If the battery goes down in the middle of a run for whatever reason, do you lose all data during that training effort?
No. It just stops right where it dies. All right. So the 405. There's the 405, the black version. There's a green version, and this is the 405CX. The difference between a 405 and a 405CX is this guy's going to actually come with the Velcro strap. It's also going to calculate calorie burn based on heart rate, where the original 405 was just on user profile. So I'm a male, I'm 6'2", I weigh 165 pounds. And it assumes your calorie burn is at a certain level. With the heart rate, it's going to be a little bit more accurate because it's actually going to be able to tell how hard you're exerting yourself. This is a big seller alone for the CX. It's a $20 accessory, so the $20 upsell to a CX really isn't a big deal if they were already going to get this anyways. And having them included in the box just means, it's an easier transition. Everything's right in one box that they need. The Velcro strap is good for people who just like Velcro straps. Also, the small wristed people, or even a really large wrist, it comes with 2 links. This is the small,